Hello everyone, thanks very much for tuning into this session and to the organisers for inviting me. It's an honour and I'm delighted to be here, although of course disappointed not to see you in person, but perhaps the next time. I want to talk about teaching writing, partly because this is one of the few things I know anything about, but mainly because I think it's one of the most difficult skills for students to acquire, and also one of the most difficult things for teachers to teach. This is because when we sit down to write, we really need knowledge of at least 5 things. We need content knowledge. What are we going to write about? System knowledge, how to put this together using spelling, punctuation and grammar. We need to know how to construct the text through drafts and revisions. We need genre knowledge. How are we going to put this content together as a message? And finally, we need to know something about who we're writing for. How are they likely to respond to the text? How are they going to use it? Now, of course, all of these things are important, but I think we need to see expertise as really at the intersection of at least 3 of them. Now, all of I plan to present really the key approaches to writing as different options, and I want to encourage you to think about these in relation to your own teaching situation and whether they may be a useful way of considering what you do. So each focus assumes a different idea about writing and implies different ways of teaching it. So the first approach concentrates on the products of writing by examining texts. The second focuses on the writer and the processes used to create text. The third approach emphasizes the role that readers play in writing, showing how we think about an audience in creating text. Now, this is a very broad approach, but I think it's a useful way of discussing some of the research and thinking about writing and how this feeds into teaching. First of all, then, I want to look at text-oriented approaches. These see writing really as an outcome, as words on a page or a screen. So this is writing as a noun rather than as a verb. There are 2 broad approaches to looking at text because we can see them either as objects or as discourse. First of all, seeing text as objects really means understanding writing as the application of rules. Writing is a thing, independent of any particular context, writers or readers. And learning to become a good writer is mainly a matter of knowing grammar. So this is what we tend to see as a product approach. And this view sees writing as the arrangement of words, clauses, sentences. And students can be taught to say exactly what they mean by learning how to put these together effectively. In the writing classroom, teachers tend to emphasize language structures, often in 4 stages. First of all, there's some kind of familiarization activity where learners study a text to understand its main grammar and vocabulary. Then there's usually a controlled writing where students manipulate fixed patterns, often using a substitution table. Then there's guided writing where the students move on to imitate models, usually filling in gaps, completing text, writing parallel text. And then finally, there's free writing where students get to use the patterns they've learned to write an essay, a letter or report or whatever. Now, this has been a major classroom approach for many years. This is certainly how I learned to write, but it draws on the rather old-fashioned and discredited idea that meaning is contained in the message and that we transfer ideas from one mind to another using language. Now this is the what lies behind the conduit metaphor of communication, which you've probably heard of, but essentially it says that that we transfer thoughts from one mind to another using language. So, for example, the lady with the dark hair has an idea, she puts it into words, into the box, sends it through the conduit, which is writing in this case. The lady with the fair hair opens the box, sees the words, and gets exactly the same idea as the lady with the dark hair. So, meanings correspond with words, and writing contains meanings rather than constructs them. This means that meanings can be written down and understood by any literate person. A text says everything that needs to be said, so there are no conflicts of interpretations, no reader positions, no different understandings. We all see things in exactly the same way, and life is wonderful. But this doesn't make sense, of course, because accuracy is only one aspect of good writing and doesn't on its own make communication. This is, of course, how lawyers make their money. They dissect and analyze the most explicitly written texts, which are written to allow no alternative meanings. But of course, the lawyers can find different meanings in them. So our goal as writing teachers can never be just training students in accuracy. I mean, I think we all know that, because all texts include what writers assume their readers will know and how they will use the text. So the writer's problem is not to make everything explicit, but to make it explicit for particular readers, balancing what needs to be said against what can be assumed. So, to put it together, if we see texts as forms which can be understood outside of any real life uses, we risk misleading students into thinking that they just need to write accurately to be effective. Now, a second way of looking at texts is as discourse, and the way that we use language to communicate, to achieve purposes in particular situations. So here, the writer is seen as having certain goals and intentions, and the ways we write are the resources that we use to accomplish this. So forms are not independent of context, but are located in social actions. Teachers look to identify the ways that texts actually work as communication by linking language forms to purposes and contexts. Of course, a key idea here is that of genre. Genre is just a term for grouping text together. So we know immediately, for example, that the text we're looking at is a recipe, a joke, or a business report. And we can respond to it and perhaps even write a similar one if we have to. So we all have a repertoire of these responses that we can call on to communicate in familiar situations, and we learn new ones as we go through life and we need them. Now, genre reminds us that when we write, we follow conventions for organizing messages because we want our readers to understand our purpose. So like the introduction, body, conclusion structure that we use to organize school essays, or the problem solution pattern, which organizes narratives. So this kind of text usually opens with a contextualizing move, which introduces the participants and the context. Then a problem is introduced for the participants. This is followed by a response to the problem. And finally, there's an evaluation of the problem, of the response. Was it successful? So genre approaches describe the stages which help writers to set out their thoughts in ways that readers can easily follow, that readers expect. All genres then have a social purpose. The main goal of a narrative, of course, is to entertain through storytelling. And this kind of model underlines all kinds of stories, from fairy stories through to Dickens, Kafka, and so on, using fairly conventional steps. Now, Jim Martin calls genre staged, goal-oriented activity, because we can't achieve our goal all at once. We need to work towards it in different stages. So another example, of course, is instructions, which describe how something should be done. They usually consist of a statement of what is to be achieved, so how to make banana muffins, a list of materials and equipment needed, a series of sequenced steps to achieve the goal, sometimes as a numbered list, and finally the target result. It uses diagrams, illustrations, and so on. Please don't make a note of this. This is not an authentic text. I made this up and I don't know anything about cooking, so you'll probably die if you eat this muffins from this recipe. Genre also tells us not just about the structure, but about the features that we're likely to find in that genre. So an instruction text is likely to be organized in chronological order, to be written very directly in simple tense, simple present, or the imperative, focuses on generalized human groups rather than individuals. It uses short, simple sentences, a lot of sequencing, signposting, and uses action verbs, doing verbs. So genres encourage us to look for organizational patterns in how we create meanings. Now, what does all this mean in the classroom? Well, it means attending to grammar, for one thing, but this isn't the old-fashioned, traditional, abstract grammar of the writing as object approach. Here, grammar is seen as a resource for creating meanings. A knowledge of grammar then shifts writing from the hidden and implicit to the conscious and explicit to allow students to write effectively. Now, in class, this often involves consciousness raising activities, getting students to notice, reflect on, and then use the conventions which typically work to achieve particular purposes. And one approach to doing this is the teaching learning cycle. You may have seen this before, but essentially the cycle helps us to plan classroom activities by showing genre learning as a series of linked stages which support learners towards understanding text. So the key stages, starting up here, is to understanding the purpose of the genre and the context in which it's used. So how does the text fit into social, academic, workplace situations? Who writes it? With whom? Who for? Why? What's the relationship between the writer and the reader? Are there status or power differences? What degree of formality is needed? So we look at a text to see what writers are trying to do in a particular situation. The next stage involves modeling the genre and analyzing it to reveal its key stages, its moves, and the key features. So what are the main tenses, the themes, what kind of vocabulary does it use, and so on. So here teachers get students typically to sequence and label text stages, or reorganize scrambled paragraphs, or rewrite unfinished paragraphs. The third step involves the joint construction of the genre through guided, teacher-supported practice. So perhaps students write a parallel text, rewriting Cinderella from the perspective of the ugly sisters, or changing the gender of the main character or whatever, or students work in small groups. Fourth is the independent writing stage, where students work alone, monitored by the teacher, And finally, the teacher relates what's been learned to other genres and contexts. So comparing the genre they just learnt with other genres they know already. What are the similarities and differences? Or how is this particular genre linked to others in the same situation? So the relationship between a curriculum vitae and an application and an interview. So each stage has a different purpose and draws on different classroom activities. So students can enter the cycle at any stage, depending on what they know about the genre, and it can be recycled at higher levels of sophistication as students' proficiency grows. Perhaps most importantly, though, the cycle provides scaffolded learning for students, supporting them through what Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. Or this is the gap between what the students can do now and what their potential performance, what they can do unassisted in the future. So what's important about this, I think, is that as students move through the different stages, they gradually gain more responsibility and teacher intervention is reduced. So moving from modelling, deconstruction, joint construction, independent, the teacher steps back, students gain more responsibility, more autonomy, and more confidence in their writing. Now, everything gets criticised. Genre has been criticised, particularly for its potential to stifle creativity by imposing models on students. Obviously, there are risks here. Teachers might teach genres as a formula, so students get the idea that they just pour their meanings into ready-made molds. But there's really no reason why providing students with an understanding of discourse should be any more prescriptive than, say, providing them with a description of the clause or the steps in a writing process. The key point, I think, is that genres do constrain us. Once we accept that our goals are best achieved by writing a WhatsApp message or an accountancy report or an essay, we're going to write within certain expectations. The genre doesn't dictate that we write in a certain way, nor does it determine what we write. It enables choices to be made, choosing one thing over another. And this is how meanings are created. It's this difference between language choices that allow us to mean. So genre theorists argue that a teacher who understands how texts are typically structured, understood and used is in a better position to intervene successfully in the writing development of his or her students. Now, the second broad approach I want to mention focuses on the writer rather than the text. So interest here is on what good writers do when they write, so that these methods can be taught to second language students and to novice writers. So some familiar techniques originated in this model, things like brainstorming, peer and teacher feedback, multiple redrafting, editing, and so on. So writing is seen as a process through which writers discover and reformulate their ideas as they attempt to create meanings. It's more of a problem-solving approach than a problem-solving activity than an act of communication, though. Writers approach a writing task and solve it as a problem. How can I express what I want to say? Now, to explain how writers solve this problem, process theorists draw on the tools of cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence. So in this model, There's a memory, a central processing unit, problem-solving programs, and flowcharts. So I think this process flowchart is well known to teachers. It shows that writers don't create text by thinking, writing, editing, but they jump between these different stages. And what the flowchart tells us, I think, is that writers have goals and they plan extensively. So in class, we get students to do internet searches, take notes, use a library. It tells us that writing is constantly revised, often in our heads before any text has been written down. That planning, drafting, revising, and editing are recursive and potentially simultaneous. And that plans and texts are constantly evaluated by the writer in a feedback loop. So plan, write, plan, write, plan, write. Now the model has some advice for teachers. I mean, that's basically what it is, a lot of advice for how we can go about this. And it says that writing involves a number of stages. So there's a pre-writing stage where brainstorming and outlining are emphasized. Students ask, what do I want to say? Who's going to read it? How can I put this together? Then there's multiple drafts where students improve each one, reflecting on whether it's effective or not. Then there's revision based on feedback, either from peers or from the teacher, or increasingly from computers in automated systems. Then the process of editing, surface corrections tend to be delayed until the end because any changes which corrects the language may impact on the ideas. So students are advised, don't touch the grammar until you're done. And then finally, the work is published, sharing it with others. Is it going to go on a website, on a wall poster, class newspaper? How can I best present it? Now this process model has been dominant in the US for probably 50 years. But I feel that students need language support and not just writing support to overcome their problems, particularly second language writers. So we need to get students to reflect on how they write, because, getting students to reflect on how they write won't necessarily improve what they write and how it's received by others. So the influence of cognitive psychology rather than applied linguistics means that teachers are concerned about what writers think about when they write, rather than the language that they need to do it. And for me, this creates four main problems. First of all, there's an overemphasis on psychology, and this neglects the importance of how context influences writing. So process focuses on the writer as an isolated individual, struggling to create personal meanings. And so it tends to represent writing as a decontextualized skill. There's little understanding of the ways language is used in particular domains and particular genres, or what it means to communicate in writing. But in fact, we very rarely just write. We write for a purpose in a given context. Is this a shopping list or is it a business report? And this involves variation in the ways that we write, not universal rules. So in other words, process models don't really give us any idea in understanding language or to confidently advise students on their writing. Second, this is a discovery-based approach, which doesn't make, as I've said, the language that students need explicit, because students aren't taught the structures of target text types, but they're expected to discover appropriate forms in the process of writing itself, or through the teacher's commentary in the margins of drafts when they're finished. Now, all this might be okay for first language students who have had years of writing experience, but second language students often find themselves in an invisible curriculum. And Amy Delpit puts this very well. She says that adherence to process approaches to writing creates situations in which students ultimately find themselves held accountable for knowing a set of rules about which no one has ever directly informed them. Teachers do students no service to suggest, even implicitly, that product is not important. They will be judged on their product, regardless of the process that they use to achieve it. And that product, based as it is on the specific codes of a particular culture, is more readily produced when the directives of how to produce it are made explicit. Okay, I think that's a good summary. A third problem is that the process approach assumes that making the processes of expert writers explicit will make novices better writers. But not all writing is the same. It doesn't always depend on the ability to use universal context-independent revision and editing strategies. Exam writing, for example, doesn't involve multiple drafting and revision. And a lot of business and academic writing is often collaborative and time constrained. So different writing involves different processes. And finally, I think the process approach really disempowers teachers. This is a model of learning based on personal freedom, self-expression, and learner responsibility, all of which might be crushed by too much teacher intervention. So this reduces the teacher to a kind of well-meaning bystander who assigns a task, stands at the side, waits for the student to finish, and then comes back and gives feedback. Now, because language and text organization are tacked onto the end of the process as editing, rather than the central resources that students need to create the text in the first place, students are given no way of seeing how different texts are written for particular purposes and audiences. This is Chris Tribble, and he says, to summarize all this, while a process approach will make it possible for apprentice writers to become more effective at generating text, this may be to little avail if they're not aware of what their readers expect to find in these texts. Okay, the writer oriented research I've just been talking about really sees context as the site of writing, where the writer is, what he or she are thinking, and so on. A final approach expands the idea of context beyond the local writing situation to the reader's context. So how writers think their texts will be understood and what they need to do to address the reader. So writers implicitly are constantly asking themselves a number of questions, because this influences how they're going to write the text. Whether the person, what the relationship is with that person, whether they are likely to agree with you or not, are key determinants. So when we write, we choose our words to connect with others and present our ideas in ways that are likely to make most sense to them. So we try and draw readers in to influence them, persuade them, entertain them, inform them, using a text that sees the world in a similar way to them. And we do this by using the words, the structures, and the kinds of argument that they're likely to accept and understand. And I think ESP teachers are well aware of this. So a reader-oriented view of writing emphasizes the interaction between writers and readers. The process of writing really involves creating a text that the writer assumes the reader will recognize and expect. And the process of reading involves the reader drawing on assumptions about what the writer is trying to do. And this, in linguistics, of course, this is called coherence. And we can only achieve coherence if our text meets the expectations of the reader. Now, Mike Hoey says this is like dancers following each other's steps, not club dancing, but ballroom dancing, where you're trying to avoid stepping on each other's toes. But each participant is building sense from a text by anticipating the other's intentions and what they're likely to do. Now, it's the unfamiliarity of these expectations, which is why writing in English is so difficult for speakers of other languages, because what's seen as logical, engaging, relevant, or well organized in writing, what counts as evidence, humor, conciseness, coherence, all differ across cultures. We're often told, you know, never tell a joke to a foreign audience. Culture isn't the only explanation, of course. We can't simply read off the ways that students write on the basis of assumed cultural differences. So we can't say, she's using a lot of relative clauses, therefore she must be a Chinese writer. But it's clear that there are different ways of organizing ideas and structuring arguments in different languages. So research suggests, for example, that academic English, compared with many languages, tends to be more explicit about its structure and its purpose. So it's constantly previewing and reviewing. And I mean, we tell our students to say what you're going to say it, and then say what you've said. And this drives Chinese students so crazy. Academic English uses more and more recent citations. It focuses on actions rather than actors. It uses very few rhetorical questions. Students often find this hard because they've been taught to use them at school very often as a rhetorical device. It's more cautious. It's less tolerant of digressions. You're supposed to stick to the point. It's very cautious in making claims, and it packages processes as things. So the emphasis is on concrete things, and it uses a lot of sentence connectors and a lot of meta-discourse more generally. So as a result, as ESP teachers, we spend quite a lot of time teaching things like nominalization, impersonalization, sentence connectives, hedges, citations, and the use of meta-discourse. Now, the differences between academic English and often writing in other languages, Michael Klein says, can be traced to the fact that English makes the writer responsible for clarity. Whereas in some traditions of writing, I don't know about Slovenia, but German, Korean, Finnish, Japanese, Chinese, the reader is expected to dig out the meaning from a dense and difficult text. It's the reader who makes the text clear, and the writer compliments the reader by not spelling everything out. But in English, it's the writer who takes that on that role so that the text can be easily understood. Now, considering readers brings us to think about the idea of discourse communities and the ways that writing is used by different social groups. Now, sometimes these are large groups like language using cultures, but we very rarely use language to communicate with the world, but with other members of our social group. So the idea of discourse community here is important as a way of joining writers, text, and readers together. It's a fuzzy idea, though. it's defined in different ways. I mean, it's a very useful concept, but it's also a very nebulous concept. John Swales, for example, sees discourse communities as groups who have collective goals, and John's suggests that they have common interests rather than goals. David Barton's definition is looser again. He says a discourse community is a group of people who have texts and practices in common, whether it's a group of academics or the readers of teenage magazines. In fact, discourse community can refer to the people the text is aimed at. It can be the people who read a text, or it can refer to people who participate in a set of practices, both by reading and writing. So there are problems with the idea of discourse community, but it helps to show us something about how language, how writing works in different disciplines and workplaces. It tells us, for example, that needs analysis is important, that we can't rely on our intuitions about writing. This is because different disciplines value different types of argument and set different writing tasks. So in the humanities and social sciences, for example, they analyze and synthesize text from multiple sources as a valued skill. Whereas in science and technology disciplines, activity-based skills like describing procedures, defining objects, planning solutions are needed. More obviously, I guess, disciplines have different ways of talking about things. So, they name and describe the world in very different ways. This is a quick analysis of 5 first-year university textbooks in linguistics and 5 in biology. And we can see that students encounter totally different content words. It's a different language. We also know that different fields make use of different genres, so that in their large-scale corpus study of 30 disciplines in UK universities, Nessie and Gardner found 13 different genre families, ranging from research report, design specifications, narratives, methodology recounts, all different. They all differ considerably in their social purpose, their generic structure, and the networks that they form with other genres. Even in closely related fields, students write completely different texts. So in medicine, for example, Jimenez found that nursing and midwifery students were given very different writing assignments. Nothing overlapped at all. So this helps us focus on the typical genres and the features of those genres that the disciplines require and that students need for success. Okay, a reader-oriented approach suggests then, instead of basing our teaching on our impressions of writing, we need to study text carefully to help students to see how different genres work with different readers. Now this is called rhetorical consciousness raising, and basically the idea is to encourage students to reflect on their own writing and getting them to analyze text to see how language is actually used by writers. And there are a number of ways of doing this, and you doubtless have your favorites. Mine are the idea of mixed genre portfolios, comparative tasks, and audience analyses. And I'll just quickly mention each of these before I conclude. Now, Anne Johns recommends using mixed genre portfolios. This is where students are asked to write a range of different genres, say an argument essay, a research-based assignment, a summary, a narrative, then collect them all together in a folder for assessment with a commentary on each one. So basically the idea of a portfolio is to give us a more accurate view of students' writing, what they can do and how they vary their language for particular purposes and readers. But it also helps students to see the different ways that genres are organized to achieve different purposes in different contexts. So it has a consciousness raising function. As an example, this is the instructions for a portfolio for secondary school students in Singapore. And as you can see, it contains an argument essay, research-based project, a summary, a writer's choice, something that they chose themselves in English, and an overall reflection of the portfolio. Now the commentary, the questions under each one are compulsory, they're mandatory, it's part of the course. Encourage students to think about what it is that they've done. Why did you organise the essay like this? Are you satisfied with it? What difficulties did you have? What did you like best? What part did you like best? What did you learn from writing it? So they're getting the questions which really interrogate students and encourage them to think about language rhetorically. You know, what is it? How can they make their meanings more successfully? Second, we can give our students comparative tasks. Now, these are excellent devices, I think, for raising student awareness of language features and how they change with readers. So, for example, we can compare the advice they find in a language textbook with a feature in real text. So perhaps looking at what the textbook says about using I pronouns or hedges, and then seeing how their expert writers use them, going through a highlight pen or search feature in the computer. Or we can compare how the same feature, maybe like boosters or connectives, are you pronouns vary across two different genres and work out why. Or perhaps how a particular feature is used in writing a genre in English with how the feature is used in their L1, getting them to notice and reflect on similarities and differences. The final feature is audience analysis. Students can be encouraged to study real readers, maybe interviewing proficient users of a genre about their writing, if it's possible. More realistically, in many contexts though, teachers can encourage students to think about who their readers are using a simple checklist. What do the readers expect to find in this text? Now, some years ago, White and Arndt suggested this simple checklist to sensitize students to the importance of attending to shared knowledge and reader response with when writing a response to a letter of complaint. And as you can see, you know, this can be done with any kind of text really, focusing on shared knowledge and student reader reaction. Okay, I've tried to cover the major frameworks very quickly that are used to look at writing, and at the same time to argue that writing isn't just words on a page or on a screen, nor is it the activity of isolated individuals expressing personal meanings. It's always a social practice influenced by cultural and institutional context. Now, what this means for teachers, I think, is that we need, as far as possible, to become researchers of the text our students need and the context in which they are likely to need them. And then, through our classroom activities, to make the features of these texts as explicit as we possibly can. Thanks very much for your attention.